So, Sam, I'm glad to be back with you for another episode of Balancing the Tensions of Leadership Across the Pond. Man, I have really enjoyed our conversations. I know today we particularly wanted to zero in on balancing the tensions of leadership in a highly competitive world. And, we've talked about supply constraints. Let's touch on competition. We've talked about employee centrism. What are you seeing in the UK and in Europe? How do leaders deal with the competition they're facing these days?
Well, really interestingly, Andy. So I'll just share with the audience, it's okay, a little bit of insight into the work I do in the professional sporting space, and then how I've seen that translate into the leaders of the organizations that I work with in the business and the corporate space. So in the sporting work that I do, very much competition is seen as a really healthy and important thing, but very much in a way of dominating. So the drive and the desire within the professional footballing teams, rugby teams, and other teams too, is when they are facing a competitor, is to ultimately reach the outcome of being more successful or winning the match or winning the competition that they face against them. And so at times that can be a great driver. It can mean that people want to train harder. They want to work harder on their systems, their formations, work harder to bring together the strongest teams because they want to beat the other. So the other team or the other teams in the division or whatever it may be. It's a real cutthroat energy of we either win or we lose. We're successful or we fail compared to our performance compared to the others over there. Right. And so the reason why I reference that is because in the sporting space, it feels very aggressive, very, as I say, I'm using the language choice deliberately, cutthroat, success or loss, win or fail. Now, in the business space, don't get me wrong, there are leaders that I work with that hold the very similar mindset. They are highly competitive people. They desire to be better than the rest. So let me change the language into a maybe softer way of describing it. So they want to be the best. They want their teams, their businesses, their organizations to be highly successful. And they do use the lens of to be better than the other or to be better than the competitor that they see in their industry or in their sector. However, there are also, what I am seeing now in leaders, more of a nuanced approach, which is they still view their competitors in a competitive way, but it's less about beating them consistently or always, and actually at times a little bit more nuanced to think a little bit more about how can we learn from each other to still get the best out of ourselves. So it feels less harsh over here with some of the leaders, rather than it just being so severe as we all beat them or we won't. It can actually be at times, how can we learn from them? How do they learn from us so that we get the best out of each other, rather than it just being that sort of almost one-on-one battle configuration?
Yeah. It's interesting because two thoughts come to mind as you talk about. One of them is that proverbial saying, when the tide rises, all ships rise with it. And I think there's a certain truth to that as well here in the States. And I really do think we're in a bit of a new season over the last several years where there's more of an awareness that we all need to be in this together. The markets are hard. The economy is a challenge. Meeting customer and client expectations is harder than it's ever been. So now is not necessarily a time for me to denigrate my competition. Now is a time for me to reinforce the value of everyone that's in my space, contributing to the public good, contributing to the clientele that we serve. The other mindset that I think I'm seeing a shift of, and I'm definitely a proponent of here in the States as we talk with leaders trying to balance this tension, is that same athletic metaphor that you used. Oh, and by the way, folks, for my audience that doesn't know Sam well, it's not just an athletic metaphor. I am sharing the screen with a highly capable rugby player. Sam has a lifetime.
That's very kind of you, Andy. Very kind of you. Yeah.
Here's the thing I struggle with on that. He was 100 stones heavier when he played rugby than he is right now.
Yeah, I was.
A U.S. person, I still don't even know what that means, Sam, but I just know you are much bigger. You're a lean, mean fighting machine these days. So he knows what he's talking about in terms of athletic competition and winning so that the competitor loses. The challenge that I'm talking about with my clients these days is, let's not view our competition against them. Let's view our competition against our last quarter, against ourselves and our performance. And that shift of mindset where I'm competing to be the best that I can be. And I think in today's market, because of the growth of the awareness of the need to have an empathetic environment in a workspace where people feel like they belong and find meaning. I think that's the type of competition that needs to be talked about here in the States. It was very evident because recently Here in the States, we just had a major U.S. football event where two highly competitive teams who'd fought all season to earn the right to be the champion faced off against one another. And at the end of the game, there was one winner, but on the field, you saw the winners and the losers hugging and congratulating and handshaking one another because they both realized we have both performed at a very high level. Sam, I will tell you, I think one of the good realities in the U.S. marketplace over the last several years has been a greater appreciation for we can win without making our competitors lose. I think that's been a healthy transition. I have a lot of concerns about leading in a new reality, and I think it presents challenges that leaders have probably not had to deal with in more than 2 generations now. I think one of the healthy things is really a reapproachment of the whole concept of competition. Who are we really competing against? We're competing against ourselves in some respects.
Andy, I really value what you've added into the discussion there, because I know the audience that are listening into this space now have had 3 potential mindsets around competition. The one was where I presented at the very beginning, which was about beating another, being better than them, putting them to one side because you push past them by beating them, and it almost a win at all cost mentality. Then there's that middle option, which is, okay, you're maybe still outwardly focused, and you're still competing against them over there, but it isn't to their detriment. It's actually, we can be in a shared space of competition, learn and grow from each other. And then really importantly, Andy, and I want to pick up on this if I can, that third mindset of actually, it's not about being externally focused, but internally focused and being in competition with ourselves. And leaders now thinking about not how they're getting on, but how are we getting on compared to ourselves? How are we in our sales versus target this year, and maybe our growth figures and percentages compared to the same time last year? And how are we evolving, growing and developing? Andy, from your perspective, and I think this is probably a really good thing to discuss for the leaders that are listening to this, say, how can they go about taking that approach? What might need to be developed for them to think a little bit more internally and maybe breeding some competitive energy about themselves rather than just always looking outward for a competitor outside?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of the questions they need to be brave enough to ask themselves as leaders. Here in the States in the last number of years, many companies have been really good at surveying their customers. And so here in the States, probably 60% of the organizations that I work with use some form of the Net Promoter Score survey that they send out to customers and clients after an engagement or after a delivery or after a service is rendered on a scale of 1 to 10. How satisfied are you? How likely are you to recommend? There's some very specific questions that have been researched and data verified on. We know what a healthy NPS score looks like. Fewer of the organizations I work with are brave enough to do a similar survey of their team members and of their suppliers. And yet the ones that I believe are setting themselves up for success in today's market view their team members as their first customer and sending out a quarterly or a twice a year confidential employee survey asking for input. And then the really cutting edge ones here in the States, they will survey their vendors and their product suppliers and their partners, their supply chain to ask them, what could we be doing better to work with you? And I think that's the type of business empathy that is going to be required as we move into our future, where people, vendors, supply chain, clients who are choosing to work with who they're choosing to work with, part of what they're looking for is that level of trust. Really, in some respects, Sam, we've moved into the whole area of trust because the market has changed and it is no longer just the value of the item itself, but do I have a trusted relationship with my supply chain, with my vendors, with my clients, where we can have honest conversations. And I think there's a growing trend here in the States and in Canada of nurturing those types of relationships. Some of the leaders I work with, that comes very naturally to them. Some of the leaders are really having to adopt what you mentioned a few minutes ago, that growth mindset, not just for their organization, but for themselves. How do I change to quit trying to find a loser so that I can win?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think they're great points, Andy. One of the things I think that we're maybe still a little bit behind of over here in the UK, particularly, is when I'm thinking about those employee surveys of where maybe organizations put out a request for confidential feedback from their people to share insight about what it is that they could be doing better or what needs to be improved. The reason why I think we're still behind is that, yes, those surveys may be being sent out and they may be being received, but at times I feel like there's quite a significant delay in anything changing or being implemented from the outcome of the results of the information that's received. So I think, and again, I may be speaking out of turn here, but from my experience, Andy, people are good at sending them out, but actually then implementing change, I think we're a little bit behind on that over here. I don't think we're doing that as readily or as quickly as we need to for the benefit of the employees to feel like their voice is being heard. Whereas if you compare that over here with some of the customer experience surveys, what some really fantastic organizations do is they will give you that opportunity to give you the feedback, and then they'll let you know what they did as an outcome. So
Yeah.
thank you for your feedback. Or because you told us this, we've changed this about our service, our process, or your customer experience will now be like this because you told us as a group of customers how we could have improved it. I think that's fantastic. And I think that really gives an empowerment to feeling heard. I just feel that employee surveys over here are still a little bit behind the trend in getting that impact as quickly as it probably should be.
Well, and you mentioned the key to it, I think about 60 seconds ago, the communication of that. And you and I have talked about
Yeah.
this a number of times, Sam, in our prior conversations. I am of the strong opinion, it doesn't matter what your title is, as soon as you are managing a team, a division, a department, an organization, one of your titles is Chief Communication Officer. CCO is the title of every leader that I work with. And Sam, if you've built an environment where people want to come to work, it doesn't take that much. And sometimes the incremental change that they're asking for just needs to be acknowledged. I think that's the challenge that I want to give to the leaders listening today is you do not have to be perfect in your execution, but let your people know that you're taking it seriously. And if you send out that employee survey, boy, you better follow up, shortly after that survey window closes with thank you for the feedback. Here's a couple of things we heard consistently that we're working on just to let them know. Now, leaders, you and I, we all know that some of the change that team members ask for some of these changes are hard to implement. They're either not reasonable or they don't work or they're going to take some time. Your people understand that as well. They just want to be heard. And so I think it behooves the leaders that you seem to be referencing. And I know that I work with Sam where they've got to remember every morning when they get up, job number one is Chief Communication Officer. Yeah. I may not have a change yet, but my people need to know that I'm thinking about it. I'm working on it. We put things together to review it. I think many sins will be forgiven if they're communicating well with their team members.
And one of the things that I've seen over here, Andy, building on top of that, is one of the best leaders or most successful leaders that I've been working with recently within the pharmaceutical space. When they were given those sorts of dynamics or situations, communication was high. It was a priority for them, but they'd also invite the people into the conversation. So it wasn't just one way of, we've heard this, we're working on it, we'll get back to you, which is great on one level because some leaders don't even do that. They don't even acknowledge what they've heard. But this leader was very good at saying, so we've heard this, we're working on this, but we've also heard you describe this other factor. Why don't you come into that conversation? And why don't you come up to the table and share your ideas? So it came from you as a body of employees. You said you wanted to see this change. Okay, we're communicating. We've heard that. Now communicate with us. Let's try and shape it together. The empowerment, the trust, the loyalty, all of those things, Andy, then came as a consequence of that because people felt heard and they felt like they then had an opportunity to input into that process.
Yeah, I think good leaders do that well. Here's the challenge with that. I suspect many of the leaders you work with in the UK and in Europe, most of the leaders that I work with here in the States are more senior in their positions. And so I'm typically working with people that are in their late 30s to late 50s. Part of the challenge is the venue for communication with their frontline workers has changed. And so it's easy for a leader to say, I want you to be involved in this conversation. But, at the very practical level, if the leader is sitting at their laptop sending out emails and their team members are on their smartphone using WhatsApp, there's a communication disconnect. And here's the point, Sam, that the challenge here is leaders need to change. I think that, that kind of 1950s mindset of the corporate suit where I'm the leader, you follow me, doesn't play today. And so the era of email communication is coming to an end for leaders that want to be effective, and they're having to meet their team members where they are. I personally find that challenging myself because my fingers are not agile enough to use the keyboard on my smartphone. And yet that's the communication venue. And so I think there's probably another discussion you and I need to have about personal leadership agility, and this whole concept that you and I've touched on, where the best leaders realize they're at the bottom of the pyramid, not at the top of the pyramid. And the stewardship of their organization and the serving of their people means that, you know, to use the military term, leaders eat last. The frontline workers go through the food line first. Leaders need to be personally agile and adopt new methods of communication if they want to truly hear from their team members. And I suspect that's true in the UK as well. I know it's true here. I'm working with a manufacturing organization right now where they're struggling with this, well-intentioned leaders, but they're not communicating with their team members on the floor in a way that the team members are even getting the communication.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely see it, Andy, over here too. What I'm going to do, Andy, if it's okay, I'm mindful we've only got a couple more minutes of this conversation today, but if it's okay, and I think my audience would really value from this, is learning a little bit more from your perspective. Maybe we can share some perspectives on this. This idea about the highly competitive world that we're within and how leaders balance that tension of thinking about the quality of the service that they provide or the quality of the product that they give to their clients and their customers. So thinking now about that competitive world and how they maybe find a position in that space, because there's in lots of spaces now so much competition for their clients or their customers' money or financial investment or commitment to the situation or the absolutely is, again, learning from what you see, what has either worked well or maybe even what hasn't worked well, but maybe some of the leaders you supported or organizations or businesses that you see over there. How are they balancing that well for success, Andy? Or how are they not balancing that well? And it's actually having a real negative impact on their competitive edge with their customers and their clients.
Yeah. You know, I think that part of that tension is you have to recognize you've got to balance the time involved as well. Carly Fiorina, president of Hewlett Packard, a number of years ago, wrote what I think is one of the best leadership books I've ever read, called Tough Choices. She was working inside an environment that was scientifically and technically driven. The people she was working with were some of the smartest people out there. And they kept going to market late because they kept trying to improve their product. And her mantra that ultimately, I believe, got her fired because she didn't have the heart of the board. But her mantra was, hey, this product is perfect enough. Given the time, given the constraints, we've got to go to market. We can't wait to iterate one more round. And I think in today's market, that phrase perfect enough, given time and supply constraint and employee-centric world, sometimes a leader has to say perfect enough. And my trust links with my supply chain and with my clients need to be strong enough that they and I together can work in a perfect enough environment. Is that true in the UK and Europe as well?
Yeah, I believe so, because what I think what can become a frustration over here is when it feels like there's a delay after a delay after a delay. And actually that idea that it's about getting the product to go to market rather than getting the perfect product to go to market, because I don't know if there ever is. So it's that balance point again. It feels like we're talking right at the heart of the tension, Andy, about being a leader that says, okay, that's good enough now. That's good enough. Our clients, our customers will give us feedback. We'll be open to it. We can make adjustments. We can get it out to market. We can receive the feedback and we can make those amendments when we need to, rather than trying to hold back, and always only ever release to the clients or customers the perfect product or the perfect service, because I don't know if that exists. And so I agree with you. It's about balancing that tension point between obviously not releasing to the market or giving out substandard quality products or services to your clients and customers. Of course, that's not what we're saying. But I really like what you've just described there. Perfect enough, rather than this pressure to be positively perfect, which I don't know if that can ever truly exist, because I don't know if every customer or client wants exactly the same thing. So what could be perfect for one may not be perfect for the other. And there is a competitive nature now that's out there. There are other places that services and products can be purchased. And so people, I believe, will find that space. It's about making sure it aligns with your values, your people, your product, and getting it out to market so it's available.
Well, and really, as we wrap up our discussion, that brings us back to this whole point of agility, because you and I both know that concept of agile development that came out of the software world really had this exact format where we're going to sprint for 3 weeks and get this code written and get it out there. And it will not be perfect, but we're done with that sprint. And then our next 3 week or 3 month or 6 week sprint, we're going to fix the code that was sloppy the first time. And that's the very definition of agile development. I think the challenge you and I are giving to the leaders that are listening in today is
Mm.
leaders need to adopt that same agile mindset in a highly competitive world if they're going to successfully balance these tensions. So, Sam, it's just been a pleasure talking
No,
with you about
I
that. There's a
agree.
lot more that we could cover, and I know we've got
Yeah.
more coming, but I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Any final words before we sign off?
I agree. Just to thank you again for your time, your contributions. I know my audience will really benefit from listening to that, Andy, and I hope yours does too. So let's wrap up that episode there and let's reconnect soon. Thanks again,
All right.
Andy.
Thanks.
Speak soon. Bye-bye now.